I keep thinking about how many women are walking around collecting symptoms that don't look related on paper but feel obviously connected in real life. So maybe their skin is reacting to jewelry all of a sudden. Maybe they have random waves of anxiety that keep showing up with no obvious story that's attached. Their sleep that keeps getting interrupted like it's on a schedule that they didn't agree to. Their bodies that feel puffy, reactive, and maybe louder than normal. And the nervous system on top of it just stays like on all the time. Histamine sits in the middle of a lot of that. It's stored in mast cells, and those cells live everywhere that you can think about where things start acting up. So your skin, your gut lining, your lungs, your blood vessels, your brain tissue. So when they release, it doesn't just show up in one little area. It shows up as itching, flushing, hives, headaches, congestion, heart rate changes, dizziness, mood shifts, sleep disruption, food reactions, sometimes all of it at once or a lot of it, which is where people start feeling like their body just changed overnight. The hormone piece sits right in the same room. Estrogen and histamine talk to each other constantly. Estrogen can push mast cells to release more histamine, and then histamine can push estrogen signaling around too. So when estrogen starts fluctuating more dramatically in perimenopause, it does this, especially in that ovulation to luteal window, then symptoms can start to shift in a way that feels really obvious once you've seen it enough times. Some women feel amazing around ovulation, and that's great, but others actually just feel anxious and puffy, reactive, wired, or emotionally sharp-edged in a way that doesn't match what they were told should happen. And then we have PMDD that fits into the same overlap for a subset of women. It's not this separate thing, but it's a pattern that can stack on top of all of this nervous system sensitivity, histamine load, and hormone fluctuation timing. So that's where you see a lot of the luteal phase sleep disruption, emotional intensity, body swelling, food sensitivities, and just general sense of the system being more easily triggered. Then there's the gut layer sitting underneath all of it. So we've got DAO, which is the enzyme in the gut that helps break down histamine, and that can run lower in some people. So that now shifts how food is tolerated day to day. Wine, cheese, fermented foods, leftovers, vinegar-heavy meals, even bone broth can feel totally fine one day and then suddenly feel like it's too much another day. IBS patterns often overlap here too, especially when the gut lining, immune signaling, and nervous system are all talking to each other at once instead of staying in their separate lanes. This is also where MCAS gets brought into the conversation in more complex cases. So mast cell activation syndrome shows up when those mast cells become more reactive and easier to trigger, often across multiple systems all at once. And alongside that, I see patterns that overlap with POTS, dizziness on standing, heart rate jumps, heat intolerance, and even connective tissue issues as well, where the body is a little bit more mechanically and neurologically sensitive. So not everyone has all of this, but the overlap shows up often enough that it becomes hard to ignore the physiology that's underneath. And then there's the neurodivergent piece, the overlap that keeps showing up in research conversations and clinical observation. So maybe ADHD traits, autism spectrum traits, sensory sensitivity, heightened environmental reactivity. It's not this one single pathway, but there's this shared theme of nervous system sensitivity and signal amplification that shows up across these groups. Histamine, mast cells, and neurochemistry sit right at the intersection, especially when sleep, stress load, and sensory input are high. One of the things that makes this harder to catch is how inconsistent it can look. So there are women who feel completely normal most of the month and then suddenly react to having some leftovers, perfume, or wine in a way that feels like disproportionate to normal. Or women who can tolerate food one week and not the next. That variability usually reflects threshold shifts, histamine load, nervous system state, gut function, hormone phase, sleep debt, all stacking in different combinations. In my own life, this shows up in a very literal way. It runs through my family in different versions, different people with slightly different sensitivity settings. Skin that reacts really fast, allergies that escalate over time, nervous systems that pick up environmental inputs really easily. I've watched it play out in small moments for years, including one kind of thing that you don't forget. I remember one time I was leaning my elbows on a hotel counter in Orlando after we checked in, the kind of place that had just been cleaned before we arrived with God knows what, and my skin immediately started reacting. Bright red, swollen, itchy, and stayed that way for hours in the humid heat, like my body, was poisoned or something, just these big elbows. That kind of reaction used to feel like I didn't know where it was coming from, but then you start to see the pattern underneath it. Mechanistically, this isn't just about histamine floating around, it's also about how well the system can clear it out. DAO activity in the gut, histamine breakdown pathways in the liver, mast cell stability in tissues, nervous system tone, sleep depth, blood sugar swings, mineral status like magnesium and vitamin C, and then the background load of modern life that keeps pushing mast cells closer to their threshold. Quercetin can often come up here because it helps stabilize mast cells so they don't release histamine as easily. Obviously, talk to your healthcare professional, but typical ranges sit at 250 to 500 milligrams once or twice a day, depending on tolerance and formulation. Bromelain often pairs with it, also in the 200 to 500 milligram range, partly because it supports inflammatory signaling modulation and it helps the quercetin to absorb. And then vitamin C can help as well, and it helps to break down the pathways and also lowers the oxidative stress that tends to amplify the reactivity. We've got magnesium glycinate at around 200 to 400 milligrams at night, can support nervous system regulation, which indirectly will lower the mast cell reactivity by shifting the baseline stress signaling. We've got vitamin B6, sometimes a DAO enzyme support. Some people also experiment with nettle leaf, maybe in a tea form, or an enzyme support that can be taken with higher histamine meals, especially when the food patterns are really obvious. And some notice shifts when alcohol is just cut out or reduced. Leftovers can be minimized, or fresh cooked food becomes more of the baseline for a while just to see what the system is doing underneath. Some people take an H1 and H2 blocker layer, but I don't suggest that to be the long-term solution. So H1 targets the histamine receptors involved in things like itching, sneezing, skin reactions, and some neurological symptoms. And H2 is more involved in gastric acid pathways that can influence digestive systems, indirectly. They can absolutely help with certain windows, but histamine itself is also part of normal physiology, involved in things like wakefulness, stomach acid production, immune signaling, learning, and memory. So long-term suppression without understanding why the histamine was elevated in the first place can shift the conversation away from the root drivers, like gut integrity or hormone fluctuations, stress load, or nutrient depletion. So I don't really love that. There are some observational studies in pharmacology discussions around long-term anticholinergic, antihistamine exposure, and how there's this cognitive risk, a risk of dementia from taking that long-term. So that's another reason I don't love that. The data is nuanced, but still something to be aware of. Labs can sometimes add pieces of the puzzle, but even when the labs are normal, symptoms can still be very real because histamine and mast cell behavior are dynamic. They're not static. So, we're just getting a snapshot in time when we take those labs, and that doesn't really tell us everything about what's going on. We need to understand timing across the cycle, triggers, load stacking, response patterns, and how things are showing up together. A lot of what I see clinically is the body adapting to higher background load, stress signals, environmental exposures, ultra-processed food, alcohol, sleep disruption, constant notifications all the time, right? Inflammation, lower recovery capacity, they all stack on top, and mast cells don't exist in isolation from that. They respond to it. So over time, the threshold or activation can shift. There's also something important in how often this shows up in families. Multiple people having sensitive systems in slightly different expressions. So skin, gut, mood, sensory processing, connective tissues, cardiovascular responses. It clusters in families a lot of times in a way that starts to feel like it's not really a coincidence, and it's more like this shared physiology meeting a shared environment. And if we zoom out, it makes sense that this is showing up more visibly now. Part of it is awareness. People can name symptoms faster and connect dots earlier, which is great, but part of it is also the load. So modern environments layer in more sensory input, more chemical exposure, more circadian disruption, processed food, chronic low-level stress signals, and the body doesn't separate those things out. It responds as a system. So when histamine pathways are already near that threshold, that extra load shows up faster, and then when clearance pathways are also stretched, like DAO, liver metabolism, sleep, nutrient status, that same trigger that used to be tolerated can now start producing a full body response instead of just like a tiny one. What I keep coming back to is this idea of threshold. Not everything is new. Sometimes the system is just closer to its limit. So normal inputs start producing louder outputs. Anyway, this is the rabbit hole that I've been in for a while, both personally and clinically, because once you see how interconnected it is, it starts to make a lot of sense.